We have a very distinguished bunch of panelists with us today, and in no particular order, let me welcome April Neubauer. If you could raise your hand so people know who you are, of the Queens Legal Aid Society. We have Donna Dougherty of Queens Legal Services for the Elderly. You can clap. It's not, you know. Josiah Madar of the Furman Center. And Christy Peel of CNYCN, which is the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. And of course, our moderator today is Marilyn Flood of the New York County Lawyers Association. This is a great city. Queens is very happy to be a part of this great city, but we certainly have our problems here in Queens, just as much of the rest of the nation does with housing. And we have received, and we will receive today, many sobering facts about the recent economic climate. And one of them is that the foreclosure crisis and its devastation to our families and to our neighborhoods has been particularly severe, especially in boards 12 and board 13, where my statistics, not the latest statistics that will be presented today, Lisa Atkins, wave Lisa, everybody knows Lisa, our housing coordinator, will tell us that over 50% of the houses there are underwater, which is extremely disturbing. Many of our residents have struggled along different paths, only to arrive at the same place, namely facing the uncertainty and the darkness of foreclosure. Often they don't know the fate of their houses or their apartments until the 12th hour, not the 11th hour, but the 12th hour, and that is when they reach out to help people such as yourselves here in this audience today. Here in Queens, we are many communities with much glory and diversity, the most diverse county actually in the United States. But when it comes to the basics essential of life, we are all one. When we are threatened, we must be prepared to defend our way of life here and to work to help our neighbors to seek a better way of life. So I'm going to ask you to turn your undivided attention to the panel because I'm pretty much done with my remarks. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask David Weprin, now Assemblyman Weprin, formerly Councilman Weprin, if he would like to come up and give us 1 minute. He is representing all the legislators here in Queens County today.
Right, you know, we have just about every member of the Queens City Council delegation and Queens Assembly delegation co-sponsoring this event along with the borough president. So since I served in the City Council and the Assembly, I guess I make a good representative. I know a number of my colleagues in government on the council and the Assembly side have staff people in the audience, and I hope someone acknowledges them during the course of the day or the evening. I don't think it'll go into the evening, but the afternoon. I do have a staff member here who will stay. I have to leave, and that's Yen Chu. Yen, if you want to just... we represent Eastern Queens, where we're also, unfortunately, hit by the mortgage foreclosure crisis. And this is a very unique presentation because it has plenty of information to help not only owners who are facing problems and may have some issues with potential foreclosure, but also tenants. So I'm very excited about being a co-sponsor, and I know you'll all get a lot out of it. And if there's any follow-up, feel free to call my office or any of the legislators' office, or of course the borough president's office. Thank you.
First speaker is Josiah Madar. He's a research fellow at the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at NYU, and he will give an overview of what's been happening in the housing market with a particular focus on Queens. And then our next presenter, and I'm sure some of these people are well known to many of you, is Donna Dougherty, who's the director of JASA Legal Services for the Elderly in Queens. The third presenter is April Neubauer, who is the attorney in charge of the civil practice in the Queens Neighborhood Office of the Legal Aid Society. And our last speaker is Christy Peel, who's the deputy director of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. All the presenters will be very flexible, and I think if you have a burning question while they're presenting, feel free to raise your hand and ask it, but at the end of each presentation there'll be plenty of time for questions, and some people may be able to stay also at the end. I'm reminding myself to remind you at the end of the program we do want to collect evaluations, so if you have to leave early, please still fill one out and leave it outside. And hopefully I'll remember to ask the rest of you to fill out your evaluation at the end. So Josiah.
Thank you, Marilyn. All right, well, I'm going to start us off by kind of setting the stage for today's program with a little bit of context and some data and kind of a broad description of some of the policy and legislative changes that have been going on in response to the foreclosure crisis. And just to start off on the next slide, just to let you know where I'm coming from with this data, I'm from the Furman Center at NYU, where we collect and analyze data. We're not advocates. Our goal is really to provide objective data to help inform policy discussions like this. And I have contact info that's at the end of this presentation, and our website also has lots of publications and data, and I certainly encourage people who are interested in finding out more about the foreclosure crisis and other issues facing New York City to reach out to us, because we're certainly happy to provide data if we have it or know where we can find it. So who are the victims of foreclosure? It sounds like a really obvious question, and we all know, especially here in Queens, what foreclosure is generally, and we know that it affects homeowners. They're probably the most obvious victims of what's going on, but lots of other groups are affected by foreclosure as well. Neighboring property owners, entire neighborhoods have been really hurt by foreclosure because of what happens to properties once they languish in the process, or if they become an REO property that's owned by the bank after the foreclosure process, and if the property sits vacant. It can really affect all the neighbors as well. Local taxpayers, when you have lots of vacant properties, which is maybe less of a problem in New York City than other weaker market upstate communities, where vacant foreclosed properties can remain vacant and become hazards and increase the cost of police protection and fire protection. We all pay for that. Tenants is a big one that we're going to spend some time talking about today. Things have gotten better legally, but it's still, there's a lot of uncertainty if you're a renter in a building and that building enters foreclosure. And a lot of tenants have been affected and displaced by the current foreclosure crisis. And then finally, they're not the most popular victims, but the lenders themselves have certainly lost a lot of money because of the real boom in foreclosures. All right. Just to give you a sense of the quarter-by-quarter trend line. This is for all of New York City. This is the number of foreclosure filings, which is historically the first official step of foreclosure. Things have changed a little bit now, where there's kind of a pre-foreclosure step. But this is the real event that we measure. Now, this is the foreclosure filing. It's not a finished foreclosure. So when we see these numbers, so for instance, in 2009, third quarter, when we see 6,000 foreclosure filings in the city, that doesn't mean there were 6,000 foreclosure auctions. That means that there were 6,000 properties on which the foreclosure process was really begun in a serious way. You can see the trend line where back as recently as 05 and 06, we were seeing only a couple thousand only, but it's a big city, a couple thousand foreclosures starts per quarter. But then in the more recent years, in 08 and 09 and the beginning of 10, we're seeing more than 4,000 foreclosure starts, or as many as 5 or even 6,000. So it's obviously really what everyone knows, that the foreclosure rate has increased tremendously. We see these funny dips here. That's really because of a legal change that required a pre-foreclosure notice as at the end of 2008, which essentially worked as a 3-year moratorium on new foreclosures. So we saw just for that one quarter the rate really drop. If we go to the next slide, it's the exact same information, but just for Queens, and the pattern is exactly the same. Queens really represents or reflects exactly what's going on in the city overall. Not surprisingly, because a lot of the citywide trend is driven by Queens, because Queens is such an enormous stock of 1 to 4 family homes, which is where most of the foreclosures are occurring. There's a lot of variety from neighborhood to neighborhood in foreclosure rates. I don't think that really surprises anyone. A lot of people, when they're studying foreclosures in the city, they really talk about Jamaica being the epicenter, both because it has a high rate and also because it has tons of 1 to 4 family homes. So when you combine those two elements, we see a lot of foreclosures. So this is looking at the number of foreclosure starts per 1,000 1 to 4 family homes in 2009. So this is a rate that allows us to compare lots of different neighborhoods in the city. You can see on the far left what the rate is for the city overall. It's just about 27 foreclosure starts per 1,000 1 to 4 family homes. Queens as a whole reflects the city average very closely. But then when you look at some of the individual neighborhoods, you see a lot of variation. So in Jamaica, it's about 58 foreclosure starts per 1,000 homes just in 2009, which is about twice as what it is the rate for the entire borough and entire city. Also, Jackson Heights is another one that I picked. Although there are really maybe 5 or 6 community districts or in a larger number of neighborhoods in Queens that have been hit very hard. And on the other extreme, then we'll see this. I put Forest Hills, Rego Park, CD 40, I think 8 or 6. I did that, but 6. Thank you. The rate is much lower, and this really you see this pattern repeated in Brooklyn and the Bronx, where there's just lots of variation. Just for comparison, this is in Brooklyn. The two highest, the CDs at the two highest rates are Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and you can see they're very high. They're actually even higher than Jamaica. So again, lots of variety from neighborhood to neighborhood. So sometimes when we look at citywide, the data doesn't look so terrible, because we see a lot of foreclosures, but it's such a big city. But then we remember when we look neighborhood by neighborhood that those foreclosures are heavily concentrated in a relatively small number of neighborhoods. So in those neighborhoods, the foreclosure crisis is just as bad as it is in some of the hardest hit parts of the country. Here's the map. I think it pretty much reflects what we were just talking about, but kind of visually, where you can see the heavy concentrations in I think Queens Village and Jamaica. And then, in this part too, in Corona and Jackson Heights, and even some in the Rockaways. So they're affecting every part of the borough, but really they are heavily concentrated in certain neighborhoods. So I'm going to race through the foreclosure process because we're going to hear about it much more in detail from my co-panelists. But this is really just to kind of set the stage so we can make sense of some of the other information I'm going to give you. This is kind of where it stands. I've left out a few steps, so this is kind of a streamlined description, but where it stands now after some legislative changes. But this is how it plays out. And it begins, as you all know, with a homeowner falling behind on his or her mortgage payments. At some point, the lender now has to send out a 90-day pre-foreclosure notice before they can actually start the foreclosure process. After those 90 days, they will formally commence the foreclosure process by filing a complaint, and then they'll file a lis pendens in the public records, which is how we as researchers identify a foreclosure start, because it puts the world on notice that there's now a foreclosure pending against this particular property or any particular property. If the homeowner can't modify their mortgage or can't work something out with the bank, they can't refinance, and when you have neighborhoods where half of all homeowners are underwater, it's obviously very hard to refinance or even hard to sell unless you're lucky enough to be able to negotiate a short sale. If you can't get yourself out of this at some point, the foreclosure process is going to typically work its way to the end, and the property is going to go to auction. And historically, that process from start to finish, from the lis pendens filing anyway to the auction, took anywhere from 12 to 18 months, maybe a little longer. But the process is getting even more drawn out now, so it can be even longer. And then finally, if the property does make it all the way to auction, meaning the homeowner isn't able to work anything out and the bank really pushes the process to the end, that property will go to auction, where it will either be bought by a new party, a third party, or the bank will take it back, at which point the property would be what a lot of people call REO for kind of historical reasons. People call them REO properties. So I think we kind of see that process and we can understand what that might mean for a homeowner. But what does that mean for tenants? Well, the traditional rule is pretty harsh. Traditionally, if a property makes it all the way through the foreclosure process, when that property goes to auction and it's bought by another party or taken by the bank, that new owner would have the right to terminate any existing leases, and the tenants could be evicted with very little notice and told to pack up and move, even if they had existing time on their lease. In smaller buildings in particular, this was a real problem because people who bought foreclosed properties, or the bank when they took a foreclosed property, they wanted to sell that property. And they thought it would be easier to sell the property if it's emptied of tenants, so that the next buyer could buy it and do whatever they wanted with that property. So that between the legal right of the new owner to terminate leases and the sort of practice of investors and lenders of clearing buildings of tenants, that added up to real problems for renters. Even then, there were some important exceptions, and sort of over the last couple of years, there have been some very important legal protections, which I'll run through too, and then we'll hear much more in detail about these legal protections. So even before the new protections, Section 8 and rent-regulated tenants, which make up a very big chunk of tenants in New York City for larger buildings, not so much the 2, 3, 4 family properties, they were generally protected from eviction. So even if the property went through foreclosure, the new owner of the property could not evict them solely because of the foreclosure. The big change then legislatively, which gave broad protections to legal protections to anyone. I'll talk a little bit why legal protections don't necessarily cover everything. But in May 2009, a new law was passed with the very promising name, Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act. That was part of a broader housing bill that reacted to the foreclosure process more generally. But what this bill does is, with some exceptions, it generally requires that if someone buys a foreclosed property, they have to honor the existing lease, or at the very least, they have to give 90-day notice before they can begin a foreclosure proceeding against the tenant. So at the very least, even if you don't have a lease as a tenant, you typically should get 90 days before you're forced out, which gives you a lot more time to find a new apartment and to pack and to get yourself settled than you might have had before this law change, when the eviction proceeding could have started pretty much immediately after the foreclosure. And then in December of 2009, just last December, a state law was passed that pretty much mirrors the federal law, but just sort of clarified how it would be implemented in New York State with its particular foreclosure process. And then also with some additional protections where when lenders start a foreclosure process, they have to give notice of what the tenant's rights are to renters, so they know what their rights are. Because, as I'll talk about in a moment, a big problem still for tenants is not knowing their rights and being essentially lied to and intimidated out of their property. And then finally, another piece of that legislation, of that state legislation, which is useful. If a landlord is in foreclosure and abandons the building, the foreclosing lender really has to step in some important ways into that landlord's shoes and maintain the building between the time that a foreclosure judgment is rendered and the property is actually auctioned. So what happens to tenants when the landlord is foreclosed on? To kind of continue this, even though there are these new legal protections, there's still a lot of risks that tenants face. One of the big problems is utility shutoffs and maintenance stopping. And you can imagine why that would happen. If a landlord is in foreclosure, it's very likely the landlord's having some cash flow issues and might not be paying their utility bills and might not be paying their staff or paying for maintenance. So even if a tenant has a legal right to stay in a property, it might not be a very enjoyable stay if the property is having maintenance and utility problems. Another big issue is this intimidation and what traditionally people have called cash for keys, where after a foreclosure, a broker or some representative of the landlord or the bank or someone might essentially lie and say, look, the building's in foreclosure, you're going to be forced out, here's $1,000 to get out now, because if you stay, you're going to get nothing. Maybe has slowed down a little bit as more people understand their rights, more tenants, but I don't know, it's definitely been a problem. And then even with the more advanced notice, where it's at least 90 days as a tenant before you can be evicted, you may still have to move. And even with 90 days notice in a city like New York with very low vacancy rates and rentals, it's hard to find apartments even with a 3-month head start. And then, of course, if you are forced to move, it's very disruptive. Children are pulled out of school. You might have difficulty commuting to your job, depending on where you move, and moving is expensive in its own right. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a few minutes just to kind of put some numbers so we know how many foreclosures are really impacting tenants. Again, because we always think of homeowners, but we don't always think of tenants. But I'm going to point out with some data that it's actually a really big deal. In a place like New York, and really nationally, a lot of tenants are affected. And we think that so many tenants are affected, even though we don't necessarily have great data really about tenant households. But we know a lot about the properties that are affected. And a few groups have looked at the types of buildings that have been foreclosed on. And there's a few studies. One from the Mortgage Bankers Association from a couple years ago estimated that about 18% of all the foreclosure filings were on rental properties. Another estimate was 20%. Another estimate from 2008 was 31%. We could also look just at how many units there are in the properties that are foreclosed. And we can see in Massachusetts, for instance, about half of all the foreclosures in 2007 were on buildings that had multiple units. When we see multiple units, we are guessing that at least one of them, if not more of them, is occupied by renters. And then similar in Chicago, where in 2008, about a third of all the foreclosure filings were on 2 to 6 unit buildings. And if we go to the next slide, we can see it's a pretty similar story in New York, but because it's such a dense city with so many multi-unit properties, it's even amplified, this issue. So this is a breakdown of property type of all the properties that entered the foreclosure process in 2009. And you can see the biggest chunk, 53%, so more than half of all the properties that entered in foreclosure were 2 to 4 family houses in New York in 2009. Most of those are going to have at least one tenant family in them. And then even beyond that, we see a smaller number that are 5+ family buildings. So when you add the units there, you're talking about a lot of units. And it's really only about a third of the foreclosures are kind of the typical, or what people often think of as the typical foreclosure on a single-family house. In Queens in particular, which has more single-family houses than the other boroughs, about half of all the properties that entered foreclosure in 2009 had more than one unit. We put together a very conservative estimate looking at the properties that were affected in 2009, where we assumed in every 2 to 4 family building, one of the units was occupied by the homeowner, which we know isn't true. Lots of 2 to 4 family buildings, they're all renter units. And we know lots of single family homes are actually renter units too. But even with those conservative assumptions, we just looked quickly at how many units that would be in properties that entered in foreclosure that could be then potentially affected by the foreclosure. And you can see borough by borough, Queens is highlighted. And in 2000, it was almost 6,000 units in Queens. 6,000 rental units with our conservative estimates. So 6,000 renter households, we estimate. At least 6,000 were affected by foreclosure. And citywide, it was 25,000 rental households. So this is on top of the homeowners. This is in addition to them. It's a pretty big number. And through the first half of 2010, it was running at about a similar rate, 11,000. You'll see the asterisk because one really big blip in the data was when the foreclosure was initiated against Stuytown Town and Peter Cooper Village, which by itself includes 11,000 units. So we're keeping that out of the data because it's kind of its own thing. So what kind of policy proposals have been out there? Well, we've already seen some of the legislative responses, which have improved the legal standing of tenants. But there's still further proposals that people talk about a lot to make things even better. Foreclosure prevention is obviously an important part of this, because each time you prevent a foreclosure, you're preventing the negative consequences that there would be both through the owner of the property and any tenants that live there. And whether it's foreclosure mitigation, counseling, the settlement conferences that are now mandatory when foreclosure process is started, that's prevention, and working out of the foreclosure process is an important part. Information, events like this, to kind of spread the word that tenants have rights, that there are resources to help homeowners, that's a really important part of it too. looking kind of less at the legal part, but just sort of the practical part too, trying to ensure the continued utility and maintenance provision. That's a very tough one to do, but it's I think something that people are looking at to try to make it work. And then kind of a trickier piece is helping tenants and buildings after foreclosure. So to make sure that properties that enter in foreclosure don't become nuisances in neighborhoods. And don't, if there were affordable housing, make sure that they continue to be affordable housing afterwards. And then tenants who get displaced by the foreclosure process, trying to help them land on their feet. We've heard from the Department of Homeless Services how many people they have in their intake system as a result of foreclosure. Well, what can we do to help tenants so they don't have to rely on Department of Homeless Services, or if they do, how can they get back on their feet as quickly as possible? So just kind of to sum it all up, there has been some progress legislatively, which we'll hear more about, and that's important. But there are a lot of problems for renters that really aren't related to their kind of legal predicament, but just the situation more general. If the landlord isn't paying his or her own bills and utilities, I mean, a legal right to stay in an apartment that doesn't have electricity isn't that great of a right. What will happen to over-leveraged buildings? There are lots of big apartment buildings that have mortgage financing on them that landlords can't afford to pay now. So these are the types of buildings that are going to have maintenance problems. And then we really don't know very much about what becomes of tenants or homeowners, for that matter, that are displaced out of a foreclosure. We don't know how many of them leave the city. We don't know how many of them double up with friends or relatives. We're studying some of these questions now, specifically where we're actually engaged in a very long research project to study how foreclosure might be affecting the education of children in households. So we hope to find some answers, but these are hard and complicated questions.